In November 2012, after 30 years of marriage and 3 children raised together, she quietly packed her things and walked out. No public statement, no tabloid war, no carefully worded press release, just silence. And for the man the world knew as Hollywood's loudest, most unstoppable force, that silence was the loudest sound he had ever heard. But here is what the headlines never told you. That separation was not the beginning of Danny DeVito's pain. It was simply the moment the world finally noticed what he had been carrying for decades. Because behind every laugh, behind every unforgettable character, behind every scene that left audiences breathless, there was a man who spent his entire life being told he did not belong. Too short, too ugly, too strange. A man Hollywood had already written off before he ever walked through the door. That same man produced Pulp Fiction, directed Matilda, built one of the most quietly powerful empires in the history of the film industry, and at 79 years old, he is still on the air on what became the longest-running live-action comedy series in American television history. How does a boy standing 4 feet 10 inches tall from a working-class family in New Jersey turn every rejection the world throws at him into fuel for one of the most improbable careers ever built? What did it cost him along the way? And what did he finally decide was worth more than everything he created? Before we answer that, we need to go back to where it all started. Daniel Michael DeVito Jr. was born on November 17, 1944, in Neptune Township, New Jersey, the youngest of 3 children in a working-class Italian-American family that smelled of Sunday sauce and carried the quiet dignity of people who had never been handed anything easily. His father, Daniel Sr., ran a small pool hall and a dry cleaning business. His mother, Julia, kept the household moving with the particular kind of stubborn warmth that only certain mothers possess. They were not wealthy. They were not connected. They were simply people who worked, endured, and expected their children to do the same. From the beginning, Danny was different. Not in the way that gifted children are different, not in the way that draws admiring glances and knowing nods from teachers. He was different in the way that invites cruelty. By the time he reached his full adult height, Danny DeVito stood 4 feet 10 inches tall. In a world obsessed with stature, with presence, with the visual authority that height conveys, that fact alone was enough to write a verdict on a boy's future before he had even chosen his own story. Classmates at Our Lady of Mercy School in Asbury Park did not see a future Hollywood legend. They saw a target. Small, round, loud, and relentless in his need to be seen, Danny was the boy who compensated for every inch he lacked with volume, with humor, with a restless, almost desperate energy that exhausted teachers and delighted troublemakers. He would later reflect with characteristic bluntness, "When you're that size, you learn fast. Either you make them laugh, or they make you cry." It was not a philosophy he chose. It was one survival handed to him. School offered little comfort. He was not the star student, not the athlete, not the boy whose name teachers remembered for the right reasons. He drifted through Oratory Preparatory School in Summit, New Jersey, carrying the particular shame of a young man who feels the gap between who he is and who the world expects him to be, but cannot yet articulate it. What he could articulate was this: he was fascinated by people, not by books, not by formulas, not by the orderly progression of academic achievement, but by the way people moved, spoke, lied, laughed, and revealed themselves when they thought no one was watching. It was an obsession that had no respectable outlet in the world he grew up in. Then came the pivot that changed everything, and it arrived from the most unexpected direction. His sister Angela was studying cosmetology. Looking for a school nearby that she could attend, she came across the American Academy of Dramatic Arts in New York City. Danny, restless and rudderless at 17, tagged along more out of boredom than ambition. He sat in on classes. He watched actors rehearse. He felt, for the first time in his life, something click into place with a quiet, unmistakable certainty. He applied. He was accepted. And in those rehearsal rooms in New York City, Danny DeVito discovered not just a craft, but a reason. But the Academy was not a fairy tale. It was a mirror, and the reflection it offered was uncomfortable. Surrounded by classmates who were tall, conventionally attractive, and headed for the kinds of careers that Danny could not even dream of audition for, he was confronted daily with the brutal arithmetic of Hollywood's expectations. Leading men had jawlines and presence. Character actors had range and patience. Danny had neither the jawline nor the patience, but he had something rarer. He had the ability to make a room feel something without asking permission. Still, the early years after graduation were merciless. Audition after audition, rejection after rejection. Not always explicit, not always cruel, but constant. The quiet, polite variety of dismissal that wears a person down more efficiently than outright hostility. Too short for this role. Wrong look for that one. Not quite what we had in mind. He survived on almost nothing. Sharing apartments in New York, taking any work that came near the theater, and slowly, painfully building the craft that would eventually make him impossible to ignore. Those years of hunger, of invisibility, of being the man in the room that casting directors looked past, did not break Danny DeVito. They did something more dangerous. They made him angry. And in Hollywood, controlled anger, channeled into performance with precision and wit, is not a liability. It is a weapon. The break did not arrive wrapped in glory. It arrived wrapped in grease paint, off-Broadway obscurity, and the kind of grinding theatrical work that never makes the highlight reels but builds the foundation that everything else eventually stands on. Through the late 1960s and into the early 1970s, Danny DeVito haunted the edges of the New York theater scene. Small productions, experimental stages, the kind of venues where the audience sometimes outnumbered the cast only slightly. He was not celebrated. He was not discovered. He was simply present, relentlessly present, sharpening something inside himself that he could not yet name, but refused to abandon. It was during this period that he crossed paths with a young, fiercely ambitious actor named Michael Douglas. They met through the theater circuit. Two men from entirely different worlds, one carrying a surname that opened every door in Hollywood, the other carrying a body that Hollywood had already decided did not fit. And yet, something clicked between them. A friendship formed in the particular way that only shared hunger and shared obsession can produce. It was a friendship that would later reshape both their careers in ways neither could have predicted in those early, threadbare years. Then came the role that changed the trajectory of Danny DeVito's life, though it arrived first not on screen, but on stage. In 1971, he was cast in the off-Broadway production of One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, playing the manipulative, darkly comic Martini. The play, produced by Michael Douglas's father Kirk, gave Danny his first genuine platform, his first real taste of what it felt like to hold an audience in the palm of a performance and refuse to let go. He stayed with the production for years, through multiple runs and revivals, and when the iconic film adaptation was made in 1975, Danny was part of the cast, stepping onto a Hollywood set for the first time alongside Jack Nicholson in one of the defining films of an entire generation. It was not a starring role. It was not the role that would make his name, but it placed him inside the machinery of serious Hollywood filmmaking at exactly the right moment. And Danny DeVito, who had spent a decade being told he did not fit, watched, absorbed, and waited. The real explosion came in 1978. Taxi premiered on ABC, and with it came Louis De Palma, the dispatcher from hell. Short, scheming, relentlessly petty, morally flexible, and somehow, inexplicably, magnetic. Louis was not designed to be loved. He was designed to be despised. A character who existed to represent everything small and bitter and self-serving about human nature, compressed into a man whose physical stature made the performance an almost grotesque comedy of scale. And Danny DeVito played him with such ferocious, committed, almost gleeful precision that audiences could not look away. For 5 seasons, Taxi ran on network television, collecting awards and critical acclaim, becoming one of the most celebrated ensemble comedies in American television history. Danny won the Emmy. He won the Golden Globe. He stood on those stages and accepted those awards with the particular expression of a man who had been told for years that stages were not built for people like him, and who found the irony almost too rich to contain. But what the awards could not capture was what was happening beneath the surface. Because fame, when it arrives after years of deprivation, does not always feel like relief. Sometimes it feels like pressure, the sudden expectation that every performance must justify the recognition. The fear that the visibility so desperately sought might be just as cruelly withdrawn as it was withheld. Danny channeled that pressure the only way he knew how. He worked harder. The 1980s became his decade of transformation. From television star to genuine Hollywood force, the leap was not guaranteed and not graceful, but it was relentless. Terms of Endearment in 1983 placed him alongside Shirley MacLaine and Jack Nicholson in a film that swept the Academy Awards. Romancing the Stone in 1984 showed he could carry comedy at the highest level of studio filmmaking. Ruthless People in 1986 proved he had genuine leading man energy regardless of what the conventional definition of that phrase implied. And then came Throw Mama from the Train in 1987, which he also directed. That film was a revelation, not just for audiences, but for Danny himself. Behind the camera, he discovered something that performing alone had never fully given him. Control, the ability to shape not just his own performance, but the entire emotional architecture of a story. The camera, he realized, did not care about height. It cared about vision. He was building something, not just a career, but an empire of a particular kind. One constructed entirely from the raw material of being underestimated. By the end of the 1980s, Danny DeVito was no longer the character actor Hollywood had once looked past. He was one of the most recognizable faces on the planet, a collaborator sought by the biggest directors in the industry, and a man whose very presence in a project signaled a certain dangerous, electric quality that could not be manufactured or faked. The boy from Neptune Township had not just arrived. He had taken over the room. Most people who loved Danny DeVito in the 1980s loved the version they could see. The explosive laugh, the perfectly timed insult, the physical comedy that turned his body into an instrument of pure, controlled chaos. They loved Louis De Palma. They loved the villain in Romancing the Stone. They loved the dangerous absurdity he brought to every frame he occupied. What they did not see was the man who was simultaneously, quietly, methodically building something far larger than any single performance. In 1992, Danny DeVito and his longtime producing partner Michael Shamberg founded Jersey Films. The name was modest. The ambition was not. Jersey Films would go on to produce some of the most culturally significant films of the following decade. Pulp Fiction in 1994, Quentin Tarantino's incendiary masterpiece that redefined American cinema and announced a new generation of filmmaking with the force of a detonation. Get Shorty in 1995, in which Danny also starred. A sharp, self-aware Hollywood satire that worked precisely because the people making it understood from the inside exactly what they were satirizing. Out of Sight. In 1998, Steven Soderbergh's sleek, stylish crime film that relaunched George Clooney's career and demonstrated that Jersey Films had genuine taste alongside genuine instincts. These were not accidents. They were the product of a man who had spent 20 years watching how power operated in Hollywood, learning its rhythms and its hypocrisies, and deciding that the only way to protect his own vision was to control the infrastructure around it. In an industry that had once looked past him at auditions, Danny DeVito had made himself impossible to ignore, not just as a performer, but as a power broker. The man sitting across the negotiating table now was not the short, strange kid from New Jersey that nobody had wanted to cast. He was the producer whose name on a project guaranteed serious consideration, serious money, and serious talent. But even as Jersey Films accumulated its remarkable catalog, Danny was simultaneously delivering some of the most memorable performances of his career on screen. In 1992, Tim Burton cast him as the Penguin in Batman Returns, and what he created was not a comic book villain. It was something genuinely disturbing. A creature of abandonment and rage, physically monstrous on the outside, emotionally devastated within. Danny wore prosthetics, raw fish breath, and black contact lenses. He waddled through Gotham's frozen streets with a waddling menace that was almost unwatchable in its commitment. Critics who expected camp received instead something closer to tragedy. He later said of the role, "The Penguin was the loneliest character I ever played. Abandoned by his parents because of how he looked. I understood that more than people might expect." That confession, brief and almost casual in delivery, contained an entire autobiography. Then came Matilda in 1996. Danny directed it. Danny produced it. Danny starred in it as the monstrous, magnificent Mr. Wormwood, one of cinema's great comic villains. And beneath the performance and the production credit lay something deeply personal. The story of a child dismissed by her own family, overlooked and underestimated, who discovers that her own power was inside her all along, was not simply a children's film to Danny DeVito. It was a mirror. The film became a beloved classic, a cultural touchstone for an entire generation of children who grew up watching Matilda triumph over the adults who had failed her. Danny understood instinctively what made that story resonate, because he had lived a version of it himself. Yet the 1990s, for all their professional triumph, were also the decade in which the invisible costs began accumulating in ways that would not fully reveal themselves until much later. The schedule was merciless. Producing, directing, and starring simultaneously meant that Danny DeVito was rarely simply present in any single moment. He was always thinking 3 moves ahead, always carrying the weight of multiple projects, always managing the gap between the creative vision in his mind and the logistical reality of getting it onto a screen. Those closest to him noticed it first. The exhaustion that lived behind the energy, the way the laughter, so natural and so constant in public, sometimes flickered in private. The particular loneliness of a man who is surrounded at all times by people who need things from him and rarely think to ask how he is. He had also, by this point, developed habits that would later become a subject of public concern. Alcohol had always been a presence in Hollywood's social life. The kind of background noise that nobody questions until suddenly it isn't background anymore. For Danny, the line between social drinking and something more problematic began to blur in ways that he would not fully acknowledge for years. There were incidents, moments of excess that his publicists managed quietly. Evenings that ended badly and mornings that started worse. Nothing catastrophic enough to dominate headlines, but enough to leave marks in the memories of people who knew him well, and enough to suggest that the relentless engine of his ambition was running on fuel that was slowly corroding the machine. In 2006, at a White House Correspondents' Dinner, Danny appeared visibly intoxicated in a way that could not be explained away. The images circulated. The commentary was not kind. He addressed it afterward with the particular combination of humor and deflection that had served him well for decades, but the glimpse it offered into a private struggle was real, and the people who cared about him knew it. What the public saw as an amusing celebrity anecdote, those closer to him understood as a symptom of something deeper. A man who had spent his entire life using performance as armor was struggling, in the privacy of his own life, to find a way to simply exist without the armor on. And underneath all of it, running like a quiet river beneath the noise of success and excess, was the relationship that had anchored everything. Rhea Perlman had been there since nearly the beginning. They had met in 1971, when Danny was still doing off-Broadway theater, still unknown, still carrying nothing but hunger and stubbornness. She had seen him before the fame, before the empire, before the world decided he was worth watching. She had chosen him when choosing him meant choosing uncertainty, chosen him in the way that only certain people can choose, with their eyes fully open to what they are actually getting. They married in 1982. They built a life together that produced 3 children, Lucy, Grace, and Jacob, and a home that Danny described in interviews with an unguarded warmth that was entirely different from the sharp, combative persona he wore on screen. "Rhea is the reason any of this makes sense," he said in one interview from the mid-90s, and the simplicity of the statement made it more convincing than any elaboration could have. But even the most genuine love can be worn down by the particular pressures that fame and success create. The absences, the demands, the way that a man who gives everything to his work sometimes has very little left when he finally comes home. The way that success can create a kind of isolation even inside the walls of a marriage, a slow, almost imperceptible drift that neither party intends and both parties eventually feel. The foundation was real, but the cracks were forming. And Danny DeVito, the man who had built an empire on seeing clearly, on understanding human nature, with a precision that made audiences simultaneously laugh and flinch, had not yet found a way to see clearly what was happening in the place that mattered most. The empire was at its peak, and the cost was coming due. There is a particular kind of pain that belongs exclusively to people who have everything. It is not the pain of hunger or rejection or invisibility. Those pains are sharp and identifiable. You can name them. You can point to their source. You can even, in the darkest moments, find a kind of clarity in their honesty. The pain that comes with having everything is different. It is diffuse. It has no clean edges. It arrives not in a single devastating blow, but in a slow accumulation of small, almost invisible moments. A conversation that ends too quickly. A dinner table where everyone is present, but no one is really there. A silence that used to feel comfortable, and now feels like a verdict. Danny DeVito had spent his entire life fighting his way toward everything. And when he finally had it, he discovered that everything comes with a shadow that nobody warns you about. By the late 1990s and into the early 2000s, the architecture of his life looked, from the outside, almost impossibly complete. a legendary career spanning 5 decades, a producing empire that had shaped the landscape of American cinema, 3 healthy children who adored him, a marriage to one of the most respected and beloved actresses of her generation, a fortune, a legacy, a name that meant something. And yet, the absences had accumulated. Not dramatic absences, not the kind that announce themselves with arguments and slammed doors, but the quiet kind. The film shoot that ran 3 weeks over schedule. The producing commitment that required him to be in 2 cities simultaneously. The way that a man whose identity is inseparable from his work will, in moments of genuine choice, almost always choose the work, not because he loves his family less, but because the work is the place where he has always known how to be himself. Rhea Perlman understood this. She had understood it since 1971, since the days when Danny had nothing to offer but the certainty of his own ambition. She was not a woman who had been deceived about who she married. She had chosen him knowingly, and she had built a life alongside him with a patience and a grace that those who knew her consistently described as extraordinary. But understanding something and being unaffected by it are 2 different things entirely. Their separation in 2012 was not announced with drama. There was no publicist's statement dripping with carefully managed language about mutual respect and amicable decisions. There was simply the quiet, devastating fact of it. After 30 years, after 3 children, after building something together that most people in Hollywood never come close to achieving, Rhea left. The world noticed, briefly, in the way the world notices things about celebrities, with a flicker of attention and then the rapid pivot to the next headline. But for Danny, there was no next headline. There was only the house and the silence and the particular weight of a man who has spent his life making people laugh, confronting, in complete privacy, something that is not funny at all. He did not speak publicly about it in any depth for years. When he did speak, it was with the careful, almost architectural restraint of a man who has decided exactly how much of himself to reveal and will not be moved past that boundary. He acknowledged the separation. He acknowledged the pain. He said in one interview, simply and without elaboration, "It's the hardest thing. When you've built a life with someone and that life changes, there's a grief to it that doesn't go away." That sentence, unremarkable on its surface, carried the weight of years. What complicated the story further, and what the tabloids seized upon with predictable appetite, was that the separation was not clean or permanent in the conventional sense. Danny and Rhea did not divorce. They separated, reconciled, separated again, reconciled again, in a pattern that suggested 2 people who genuinely could not define their relationship as either wholly broken or wholly whole. They were seen together at family events, at their children's milestones, at the ordinary occasions that life produces regardless of the state of a marriage. They were photographed together in ways that prompted headlines alternating between reunion and split, depending on the week and the photographer. For Danny, this ambiguity was not a performance. It was the honest reflection of something genuinely unresolved. He loved Rhea Perlman. That was never in question. The question was whether love, even genuine and enduring love, is sufficient to sustain a partnership against the accumulated weight of decades of choices, absences, and the particular damage that fame inflicts on the private life of anyone foolish enough to pursue it. Their children watched. Lucy, Grace, and Jacob, grown by this point, carrying their own complex inheritances of a childhood divided between extraordinary privilege and the particular loneliness of having parents whose lives belonged, in a fundamental way, to the public. They navigated their parents' ambiguity with a dignity that spoke well of both of them. But the impact was real, and Danny carried the knowledge of it with him everywhere. There was also the question of his health. By his mid-60s, the physical toll of a life lived at maximum velocity was beginning to present its invoices. The weight that had fluctuated across his career had settled into a configuration that his doctors found concerning. His heart, his blood pressure, the general infrastructure of a body that had been treated more as a vehicle than a temple for 50 years, required attention that he had consistently deprioritized in favor of the next project, the next commitment, the next demand on his time. He began, gradually and not entirely willingly, to slow down. The producing slate at Jersey Films contracted. His on-screen appearances became more selective. The relentless forward momentum that had defined every decade of his career began to ease, not because the ambition had faded, but because the body was presenting an argument that the mind could no longer entirely dismiss. And in the stillness that followed the slowing, things became visible that the momentum had kept hidden. The loneliness, first of all. The particular solitude of a man who has always defined himself through his relationships, through the laughter he generates, through the warmth he creates in rooms, discovering that rooms empty eventually, and the laughter fades, and what remains is simply the man himself, sitting with the accumulated weight of everything he has built and everything it cost. The grief, too. Not the acute grief of sudden loss, but the slow, chronic grief of a life lived at such intensity that certain things were simply never attended to. Moments missed, words unsaid. The quiet, ordinary texture of a life that fame makes almost impossible to inhabit fully. Danny DeVito had given the world an extraordinary gift across 5 decades of work. He had made people laugh in ways that required genuine courage and genuine craft. He had built things that mattered and told stories that endured. But the invoice for that gift was long. And in the years following the separation, sitting in the houses that had once been full and were now quieter, Danny DeVito began for the first time to truly read it. There is a moment in the career of almost every enduring artist when the industry decides, with the casual cruelty that only industries can manage, that the time has passed, that the relevance has expired, that the space once occupied so powerfully is now needed for someone newer, someone younger, someone whose face does not yet carry the lines of everything they have survived. For most people, that moment is the end. For Danny DeVito, it became the beginning of something nobody saw coming. By the mid-2000s, the landscape had shifted around him in ways that were subtle but unmistakable. Jersey Films was no longer producing at the pace that had defined the 1990s. The blockbuster era had accelerated into a franchise economy that valued intellectual property over individual vision. The kind of smart, idiosyncratic mid-budget films that Danny had built his producing empire on were becoming commercially endangered, squeezed out by superhero spectacles and animated franchises on one side and micro-budget independence on the other. His acting work had not dried up, but it had changed in character. Supporting roles where leading roles had once been. Cameos where starring vehicles had once been. The particular recalibration that Hollywood performs on its veterans without announcement or apology, simply adjusting the size of the frame around a person until they understand, through the architecture of diminishment, that the room has been rearranged. Danny DeVito understood the message. He simply chose not to accept it. In 2006, a small, anarchic, deliberately offensive comedy called It's Always Sunny in Philadelphia was entering its 2nd season on FX. Created by and starring 3 young unknowns, Rob McElhenney, Glenn Howerton, and Charlie Day, the show was unlike anything on American television. Crude, dark, Morally inverted, structurally chaotic, it followed a group of spectacularly selfish, delusional, and frequently monstrous people running a bar in Philadelphia with almost no redeeming qualities and absolutely no interest in acquiring any. It was, by any conventional measure, an extremely strange place for a Hollywood legend to plant his flag. Danny DeVito did not care. He joined the cast as Frank Reynolds, the depraved, morally absent, gloriously unhinged father figure whose relationship with money, dignity, and basic human decency was entirely optional. Frank was not a character designed for sympathy. He was designed for something more interesting than sympathy. He was designed for truth, the ugly, uncomfortable, howlingly funny truth about what people actually are when they stop pretending. And Danny played him with a freedom and a commitment and a sheer unrestrained joy that was immediately, viscerally apparent. This was not a man collecting a paycheck or maintaining visibility through a strategic television appearance. This was a man who had found, in the most unlikely corner of the television landscape, a character that allowed him to do things he had never been permitted to do before. Frank Reynolds was shameless in the most liberating possible sense. He existed beyond embarrassment, beyond consequence, beyond the ordinary social contracts that govern human behavior. Playing him required Danny to abandon every instinct toward likability, every professional habit of performance calibrated for audience approval, and simply inhabit a creature of pure, unmediated appetite. The result was extraordinary. It's Always Sunny in Philadelphia became a cult phenomenon, then a genuine cultural institution, eventually surpassing The Simpsons to become the longest-running live-action comedy series in American television history. And Danny DeVito, the Hollywood veteran who had joined a scrappy cable show when the industry had quietly suggested his moment had passed, became one of its most essential and beloved elements. Younger audiences who had no frame of reference for Taxi or Batman Returns or Matilda discovered him entirely fresh, as Frank Reynolds, as this magnificent, grotesque, utterly committed performance that seemed to arrive from somewhere beyond ordinary acting. They loved him with the particular ferocity that young audiences reserve for artists who feel genuinely, dangerously real. He had not reinvented himself in the hollow, manufactured way that publicists engineer for fading celebrities. He had simply found a new room where his particular kind of fire was not just welcome, but essential. And he had walked through the door without apology. But even as the professional reinvention was producing its remarkable results, the personal battles continued with no regard for the triumphant narrative. The incident that had occurred at the White House Correspondents' Dinner in 2006 had not been an isolated moment. Those who knew Danny well understood that his relationship with alcohol had been a complicated and sometimes destructive presence in his life for years. Not constant, not defining, but recurring. The kind of relationship that a person can manage for long stretches and then, under sufficient pressure, cannot. He never made a formal public statement about it. He never entered a rehabilitation facility in the visible press release manner that Hollywood has developed as its standardized ritual of acknowledgement and redemption. What he did, quietly and without fanfare, was address it on his own terms. Conversations with people he trusted, changes in behavior that his inner circle noticed without being asked to notice. The gradual, private work of a man deciding that certain things needed to change, not because the world demanded it, but because he demanded it of himself. It was consistent with everything else about him. Danny DeVito had always done things on his own terms. Why would the hardest things be any different? His health required serious attention during this period as well. The physical architecture of a man in his 60s and 70s carries the accumulated decisions of every preceding decade. and Danny's body was presenting a detailed accounting. Weight management became a genuine medical priority rather than an aesthetic concern. Cardiovascular monitoring. The careful management of a constitution that had been treated with considerably more enthusiasm than caution for most of its existence. He approached it with the same stubborn pragmatism that he brought to everything. Not with the evangelical fervor of a convert, not with the performative wellness culture that Hollywood produces in abundance, but with the quiet, determined compliance of a man who has decided he is not finished yet, and is willing to do what is required to ensure that, and threading through all of it, through the professional reinvention and the private battles and the health reckonings and the ongoing, unresolved complexity of his relationship with Rhea, was something that had been building quietly for years and was now becoming the central organizing principle of his life. Family. Not family as an abstraction, not family as the thing you mention in award speeches and then return to the hotel suite from, but family as the actual daily substance of existence. Lucy, Grace, and Jacob were adults now, navigating their own lives with the particular mix of gifts and complications that come with being the children of two of Hollywood's most recognizable faces. Danny watched them with a pride that he expressed in the unguarded, almost embarrassingly open way that had always been his register for the things that actually mattered to him. He showed up at the events that mattered and the ones that didn't, at the ordinary occasions that fame trains people to consider beneath their attention. He showed up because he understood, with the hard-won clarity of a man who had spent decades choosing work over presence, that showing up is not a gesture. It is the whole point. His relationship with Rhea, meanwhile, continued its complex, unclassifiable evolution. They were not together in the conventional sense. They were not apart in any clean or final sense either. They occupied a space that resisted the categories that the public and the press preferred to apply. Something older and more honest than the language of relationship status could contain. Two people who had built a life together, who had damaged it and repaired it, and damaged it again, who had discovered that 30 years of shared history creates bonds that neither separation nor reconciliation can fully describe. In 2023, after years of ambiguity, reports emerged that the separation had become permanent, that the divorce, long deferred, was now proceeding. Danny did not comment publicly. There was nothing to perform and nothing to manage. There was only the private weight of an ending that had been arriving, in one form or another, for a very long time. He was 78 years old. He had survived bankruptcy and rejection and physical accidents and public humiliation and the slow erosion of a marriage he had genuinely loved. He had built an empire and watched it change shape around him. He had been dismissed and had returned, not once, but repeatedly, each time with something the dismissers had not anticipated. The refusal to disappear was not a strategy. It was not a brand or a narrative or a carefully managed career move. It was simply who he was. The boy from Neptune Township who had been told in 1,000 different ways that the world was not built for people like him had spent his entire life proving, with increasing and sometimes reckless enthusiasm, that the world was wrong. He was still proving it. And the most remarkable chapter of that proof was not behind him. It was still, stubbornly, defiantly, characteristically ahead. In the autumn of 2024, Danny DeVito turned 79 years old. There were no grand celebrations orchestrated for public consumption, no retrospective specials commissioned by networks eager to remind audiences of what they already knew, no carefully staged photographs designed to signal vitality and relevance to an industry that monitors such things with the cold continuous attention of a surveillance system. There was simply a man in a house in Los Angeles, surrounded by the people he loved, marking another year with the quiet, unperformative gratitude of someone who understands, from genuine experience rather than inspirational abstraction, that years are not guaranteed. He had earned that understanding the hard way. To look at Danny DeVito today is to look at the living residue of an extraordinary collision between extraordinary talent and an extraordinarily resistant world. Every line on his face is a document. Every role he chose, every battle he fought, every relationship he built and damaged and rebuilt. Every morning he got up and decided that today, again, he was not finished. All of it is written there, in the particular way that only authentic lives get written, without the smoothing effects of narrative convenience or the flattering light of selective memory. His body, at 79, carries its history honestly. The weight that has defined him since childhood, the physical presence that Hollywood once treated as a limitation, and that he transformed into one of cinema's most distinctive and recognizable instruments, has settled into something that his doctors monitor, and that he manages with the disciplined, slightly reluctant compliance of a man who has made his peace with the fact that the body has opinions that must now be consulted. The spine that compressed under decades of physical performance, the eyes that require careful light and careful rest. The cardiovascular system that demands the consideration it was not always shown in the years when everything felt invincible. He tends to all of it, not with the fervent, performative dedication of a convert, but with the steady, practical attention of a man who has decided he has more to do and is willing to maintain the machinery required to do it. It's Always Sunny in Philadelphia continues. Somehow, impossibly, gloriously, it continues. In 2024, the show entered its 16th season, a fact that defies almost every law governing the natural lifespan of television comedies, and stands as perhaps the single most improbable achievement in a career constructed almost entirely from improbable achievements. Danny DeVito, approaching 80, remains one of its most essential forces. Frank Reynolds has not mellowed. Frank Reynolds will not mellow. That is both the character's defining quality and, in a way that is not entirely metaphorical, its creator's. He is still working. Not frantically, not with the 7 projects simultaneously velocity of his peak years, but with intention. Selective appearances in films and television that interest him, that offer something worth doing rather than simply something worth being paid for. Voice work, producing commitments that carry his genuine fingerprints rather than just his name. The work of a man who has not retired from the field, but has chosen, with the authority of someone who has earned the right to choose, exactly which parts of the field still deserve his energy. His fortune, accumulated across 5 decades of performing and producing, is estimated at somewhere between $60 and $80 million. It is not the astronomical figure that certain Hollywood dynasties command, partly because Danny DeVito has never been primarily motivated by the accumulation of wealth, and partly because the kinds of projects he has consistently chosen, the idiosyncratic, the risky, the artistically interesting over the commercially inevitable, do not always produce the returns that safer choices would have generated. He does not appear to find this troubling. What he does with that fortune speaks more clearly than the figure itself. He has been a consistent supporter of progressive political causes, of environmental organizations, of the kinds of advocacy work that align with the values he has held since long before holding them was fashionable or professionally advantageous. He gives without the elaborate apparatus of branded philanthropy, without the foundations named after himself, and the press releases announcing each act of generosity. He gives because he believes in giving, with the straightforward conviction of a man from a working-class New Jersey family who has never entirely forgotten what it felt like to have nothing. His 3 children, Lucy, Grace, and Jacob occupy the center of his emotional life with a completeness that his career, for all its extraordinary reach, never quite managed to achieve. Lucy has followed her parents into acting, building a career of her own, with a determination that clearly owes something to the genetic inheritance of two parents who never accepted the word no as a final answer. Grace and Jacob have moved through their lives with the particular combination of groundedness and complexity that comes from growing up inside the most scrutinized industry on Earth while being raised by people who understood, at least eventually, that the scrutiny was not the point. Danny speaks of them with an openness and a warmth that strips away every layer of the performer and reveals something simpler and more essential. A father. A man who knows, with the precision that only the experience of having almost lost it can produce, exactly what matters. "Everything I ever made," he said in a rare extended interview in 2023, "every film, every show, every deal, every fight I won, and every one I lost, none of it comes close. Not even close. These three people are the whole thing. The rest was just the noise I made getting here." And Rhea, even now, even through the separations and the reconciliations and the final painful settling of a relationship that had defined both their lives for half a century, Rhea Perlman remains woven into the fabric of who Danny DeVito is in a way that legal categories cannot adequately describe. They share children. They share history. They share a mutual knowledge of each other that only 30 years of genuine intimacy can produce, the kind of knowledge that survives the ending of a marriage because it was never really about the marriage. It was about two people who saw each other clearly and chose each other anyway. He does not pretend it was simple. He does not perform closure for the benefit of an audience that wants its stories to end neatly. He carries the complexity of it with the honesty that has always been his most reliable quality. The same honesty that made Louis De Palma unforgettable, that made The Penguin genuinely heartbreaking, that made Frank Reynolds something closer to a philosophical statement than a comedy character. The world handed Danny DeVito every reason to disappear. The height that Hollywood decided was a disqualification. The face that did not fit the template. The background that offered no connections, no advantages, no safety net. The industry that adjusted its frame around him without announcement or apology. The personal losses that arrived with the particular cruelty reserved for people who have worked too hard and too long to have any defenses left. He refused. Every single time, he refused. Not with speeches, not with manifestos, not with the elaborate public performance of resilience that our culture has learned to consume and discard with equal efficiency, but with the simple, stubborn, almost aggressive act of continuing, of showing up for the next audition, the next project, the next season, the next morning, of finding in each new room he entered something worth fighting for. That refusal is his legacy. More than Taxi, more than Batman Returns, more than Matilda or Pulp Fiction, or any frame of any film or any episode of any show. The refusal itself, the living, breathing, still working demonstration that the world's verdicts about what a person can be are not final unless the person agrees to make them final. Danny DeVito never agreed. He is still disagreeing. And somewhere in Neptune Township, New Jersey, in the distant, unreachable past, a small boy who was told in 1,000 different ways that the world was not built for people like him is watching, from inside the man he became, with something that looks very much like satisfaction. Not pride, not triumph. Just the quiet, undefeatable knowledge of a life that was lived fully and fiercely and on nobody's terms but his own, all the way to the end. And the end, it turns out, has not arrived yet.